Hi, this is Nicholas Bell with IONCINEMA, here to review Crash, the 1996 cult classic directed by David Cronenberg, which Criterion released December 1st, 2020, with a new 4K restoration. So of course, if you're aware of Crash, you either love it or hate it. I am, of course, in the love group for the film and the novel, actually, which are both two very different, equally divisive pieces of art. So J.G. Ballard wrote his book in 1973, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, especially with the foreword from the original French print. It's fascinating. And then, of course, Cronenberg made the film in 1996, straddling the kind of AIDS pandemic, which I think is interesting. I think the context within which both of these pieces exist is also pertinent, the reactions to them. I think all of that is fascinating. Anyway, it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, won a special jury prize. The jury president, Francis Ford Coppola, notably hated the film, as did the Daily Mirror in the UK, which tried to run a campaign to get the film banned. Of course, it was released in the US as NC-17, and I think 25 years almost on, we can kind of look at this as clinically as Cronenberg does Ballard's own novel. So the main character is named after James G. Ballard, played by James Spader. The book is a very subjective, sexual, very graphic sexual fantasy. People have described these characters as omnisexual, and I think that is one way to look at the kind of fluidity of this. If Ballard was speaking to a kind of masculine, toxic fantasy that was veering, to the left of, in response to the women's liberation movement or what have you going on, set in London, of course, up and down Western Avenue, which kept reminding me of Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. Then Cronenberg is looking at these people from a bird's eye view that are kind of numb at the beginning of a new millennium, and that have become so desensitized that their only reminder of what life feels like is by bringing it as close to death as possible. And kind of the difference between where fetish runs into death and reality. So James Spader stars, of course, and Holly Hunter is Dr. Helen Remington. They meet in a car crash in the beginning. He kills her husband because of his terrible driving, and then they're both kind of reawakened to their sexual senses. There's a great insert by Jessica Kiang, who writes about their obsession with their mechanical obsession with biological impulses without biological consequences, and how whatever species these people belong to, they are the last of their generation, which is definitely the sentiment you feel. If there's anything remotely hot in the film, it's the icy hot of Deborah Unger as his wife Catherine. In the book, it's a little more explicit that they're having a sexual stagnation, if you will, and she's kind of willing to do whatever it is her husband's interested in. They're almost neck and neck for competing with each other sexually and daring one another. And she's not so much into the car crash set, to borrow a lyric from Warm Leatherette, which was a track by The Normal in the late 70s in response to an admiration of Ballard's novel. She walks away as kind of the most human of these robotic ciphers, if you will. Cronenberg paints her as this very clinical, sexually perverse being. And I think that if you also take into consideration it's 1996 and you have James Spader and Elias Koteas that do have a sex scene, I think also added to the outrage of this blatant homosexuality in the art house, which also was rare from a heterosexual director. I think there's just so much to love about it, but I think Kiang, her essay is a good place to start to unpack some of these themes, especially comparing novel and film. Not that you have to read the novel to appreciate the film, but I think it does add an extra textual layer to how Ballard was set in the present. Vaughn, played by Elias Koteas, is the ringleader of this car crash set, and he is obsessed with his death sex fantasy is to involve Elizabeth Taylor in a car crash, and Elias Koteas is obsessed with past famous car crashes. In the book, he drives a 61 Lincoln Continental, which JFK was assassinated in. In the film, we meet him reenacting James Dean's crash, and his ultimate fantasy is to do the Jane Mansfield decapitation, which his stunt driver Seagrave does, which is part of the dramatic catalyst for his unwinding. Overall, it's a little more vignette styled in Cronenberg's version. Ontario, of course, is not London, and nobody mentions Mississauga, but ostensibly this is the stretch of road we're looking at, which obviously isn't exciting, but he's able to transport us into this weird parallel realm of, you know, pre-millennium Canada, if you will, but with very notable American actors. I think Kara Unger is fantastic in this with her Veronica-like hair, and Rosanna Arquette, of course, is a notable camp factor, and she kind of gets into more of the classic Cronenberg body horror with her scars that James Spader is titillated by. There's so much more like scar fucking and body tissue and body secretions in the novel that could have possibly made it into a film maybe in 1996, so I really recommend reading both. And if the novel is kind of like a red hot fantasy, the film is its cold death shroud, if you will, because Hunter and Spader are just, they are cold and icy to the they are the chrome, ice chrome to the touch. Elias Koteas, I think, is interestingly cast. I think Arquette's a lot of fun if you like camp. It was shot by Peter Suschitzky, of course, who Cronenberg has utilized many times. Howard Shore provides, you know, because Cronenberg didn't go the obvious route. He could have had Warm Leatherette in the soundtrack, but instead he chose this very kind of equally glacial Howard Shore score that I think works perfectly in like the penultimate scene in the car crash sequence that Elias Koteas and crew come upon with Seagrave, who had been in drag as Mansfield, and his body is out for the public to see. Overall, I would give Crash 4 out of 5 stars, and Criterion's Blu-ray release 4 out of 5. I think it's also an excellent sister film to Cronenberg's own Naked Lunch, which took an incomprehensible novel, if you've read Burroughs' novel, also with extremely queer subtext. He went, you know, kind of the opposite direction with excess and meta references to Burroughs himself, which he doesn't. This is very downplayed, technically a lot more subtle than the novel. But I recommend seeing that in conjunction with reading the novel. It's an exciting time to revisit Crash beyond the fear of the cultural gatekeepers of the late 90s, and I would, there are of course a bunch of extra features, Q&As from the press conference and from Cronenberg, a 1997 audio track. I give Criterion's release of the title also 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.